Umar's epithets, his titles, um, the nicknames that he's associated with. Ibn al-Khattab, the son of the book or the son of the writing, and the other one, which is of interest, is the Savior, Al-Faruq. So these are going to be very important. So here's where some interesting information and evidence have shown up. Didn't expect to find it when I looked into the origin of the Alawite sect. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a quick overview of the Alawites because they give us a few clues from the past.
Just so people know who the Alawites are, the Alawites are in existence even today. These are the ones who are in power in Syria. The Alawite dynasty, or the Alawite sect, it's a group within Islam that is much more aligned with Shiism than it is with Sunnism.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a book called the Kitab al-Majmu', which means Book of the Collections, composed of 16 surahs. So that's going to be our source for what I'm going to say later. The Alawites are believed to have been founded by Ibn Nusayr during the 9th century. The book was written down by a former Alawi member who became a Protestant or a Christian, and it was printed in the 1860s. So this was something that was meant to be kept a secret within the sect for obvious reasons, because this group has been persecuted by the Sunnis and the Shias down through the centuries, so obviously they don't want their doctrines known. But in those doctrines, we can trace some of the early ideas that were in that large pool from which the various sects drew their ideas from, and that's why it's of relevance to us. It is believed to represent the secret doctrines of the Alawite sect. And I just want to mention that the name Alawi appears as early as the 11th century, so it isn't just a recent name. It's also referred to as Nusayri, but I'm going to stick with the other name. Now, in their belief, they have this idea that Ali is the mana, or God's manifestation. Muhammad is the hijab, or veil, that conceals Ali's true identity as God. And Salman al-Farsi, or Salman the Persian, is al-Bab, or the gate. Now, I'm not going to get involved too much in their theology, but they have a sense that these three historical individuals were in some way a manifestation of God, which is a very similar notion to the Zoroastrian idea that God manifests himself in history. So that's their belief. So these three figures, Ali, Muhammad, and Salman al-Farsi, are going to be key to unraveling all this. So I'm going to draw our attention to a few key passages from this book. So in Surah 1, I just want to emphasize, when we're talking about the surahs, this is not from the Quran, this is from the Alawite book. It says, "It is you, O Emir of the bees, O Ali ibn Abi Talib." Now, what does a bee do? A bee goes around to different flowers, pollinating them, taking a little bit from each flower. And if we look at the Quran, we see that sort of thing going on, a little bit from here, a little bit from there. So it's an interesting title that Ali is given in the Alawite sect. And we can see here that he's also referred to as Abu Turab. So if we can remember that Ali is also referred to as Abu Turab. There's a reference to Salman there, which I'm not going to go into. And it says here, "Secretly you are our God and openly our Imam." So, this is obviously a doctrine that Alawites don't want the public to know about, the idea that they believe Ali and Muhammad, etc., are a god in some way. And it says, "You appeared in the divine essence, you rose in the form of Ali and veiled in the form of Muhammad." So it's kind of like the Trinity, essentially, that they have. That the idea of the Trinity, but focused on Ali, Salman, and Muhammad. Now in Surah 4, it talks about Ali as the adored, Muhammad as the praised, and Salman as the object of desires. Surah 7 it refers to Muhammad as the chosen one. Now that's significant because the chosen one in Christianity would be the Messiah, or even in Judaism, it's a Messiah. So you can see here that the Alawites have this belief that Muhammad was the Messiah, which is significant. This may trace all the way back to the 7th century, that idea. We also have further references to Muhammad and Salman and Ali there, but we'll just move on. So this one is significant. It says, mystery of the temple, of the vault of the temple, of the floor of the temple, of its 4 cornerstones. The temple is Lord Muhammad. The vault of the temple is Abu Talib. Now, what's interesting is that a few months ago, Joe was on your channel and he mentioned that one of the meanings of Muhammad is it means temple.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have the Alawites clearly aware of that meaning, and they're referring to Muhammad as a temple. And, you know, a temple is where God's presence is. So it's obviously suggesting that Muhammad is in some way divine. And we see an image of Umar entering Jerusalem there in the center, or at least an illustration of it. One of the things that he set about doing was he went to the location where the Dome of the Rock is now. But you can see on the picture on the far left, you have the rock there, which is exposed. This was believed by Jews and Christians to be the very place where Abraham went with Isaac to sacrifice him in obedience to God. What does Umar do when he eventually got to Jerusalem? He built a masjid, or a place for prostration, a place for prayer on that very site. And so it's interesting how all of this fits together.
It's fascinating because I've just done a video. It's you all can see it. It's up online now with Paul from London, who you introduced me to, Mel. Thank you so much. And Paul does a whole series of reference points like the Masjid al-Haram, which is the forbidden place of bowing, the place to bow, which is the place what Muslims claim today is in Mecca, the Kaaba, where that cube is, that's black cube is. He would say, no, all these references to Masjid al-Haram is exactly right there where you're looking right now, which is where the temple lived. This is Mount Moriah. This is where Abraham supposedly sacrificed, or was going to sacrifice Isaac. And it is the place that the Jews and Christians still believe today where that happened. It's where the temple then was built, was then destroyed in 70 AD. And then it looks like Umar comes and then builds his own, his own Masjid al-Haram, or he would call it just a masjid, if the word masjid was that early. We're not sure that's that early even. But it's fascinating that everybody is going to that same rock, to that same mount, because of its historical relevancy.
Yeah, and just an extra little note, Sebius has a different version on this. He tells us that the Jews had constructed a place of prayer over that area at that time. And when Umar came in, he basically said, we're having that, you'll have to find your own place of prayer. And he did some additional work. So it's between the two groups, which of them actually built it. I'm not 100% sure which is the right version, but I presume there was something there that he took over and decided to make that a focal point of prayer. Now, so the key thing, I think, to draw our attention is the fact there are 3 individuals, Muhammad Ali and Salman al-Farsi, who together are the core 3 individuals for the Alawites. Okay? And a reminder that Ali is also called Abu Turab. Now, if we turn to the following, there is a correspondence or a series of letters between what Leo III wrote in the 8th century and the Alawite doctrine. Now, Leo III was the Byzantine emperor, and in the 8th century, he wrote to another Umar of the 8th century, not to be confused with the Umar that we've just mentioned. He wrote to Umar II, and basically they had a debate between both sides, and Leo is quite scathing about this new religion that seems to have emerged, and he's quite mocking. And he basically says the following, and this I want to credit Murad for this. So he says it was Umar, Abu Turab, and Salman the Persian who composed that, and in quotations, your Burkan, which actually should be your Furkan, even though the rumor has got around among you that God sent it down from the heavens. You see what he's saying? He's basically saying this book of yours was composed by three people: Umar, Abu Turab, which is Ali, and Salman the Persian. He doesn't believe for one moment that this is a revelation come down from Ali. He essentially knows who the three people are behind this set of writings.
And as you well know, oh, you're going to say it right now, Furqan does mean Quran. It's another name for the Quran. I see you just put it up there on the screen.
Yeah. So this was the very earliest name for the Quran. It was actually decades after the first scraps or writings where it came from, before the word Quran was coined for the book. But it's interesting he mentions three people: Umar, Abu Turab, and Salman the Persian. But look at the Alawite doctrine again. It focuses on Muhammad Ali and Salman al-Farsi. Do you see the common factor? Let's have a look at the next slide. So as you can see there, when you compare Leo III's list of three people and the Alawites' trinity, if we can call it that, we see that this would suggest that Umar is Muhammad. Quite incredible, isn't it?
You'll be fine. Yeah. Listen, can I just interject at this point? What you're bringing up, Mel, and maybe we're going to have to do a whole complete different episode on this. And I think your good friend LaFontaine is probably the person to bring on board, because he is the one that's unpacked this for you, has he not?
Yeah, he is the leading expert on this area, and I think he'd be the key person to unpack it. He's done an awful lot of work on this, and his book is being translated at the moment into English, and it's a free PDF, The Great Secret of Islam. It's on his website, and you're all welcome to download it and read it for yourself, and it will kind of explain it much better.
And what is the thesis of what he is saying? I know we're kind of doing an aside here, but this is important because with Leo III, as you're saying, Leo III confronting, in this case, Umar II, and we're talking of this has to be before 720, because that's as far as Umar II range. So this is pre-750. You're talking about the 8th century. So we're talking about a good 70 years after Umar. You're saying that this Umar is the name Muhammad. That's the epithet that he gives, but it is the Umar. And you're saying that this man is responsible for creating a book, and that this book was put together by these three individuals. That means it would have to have been put together in the mid 7th century. If they're being put together if this book has been put together in the mid 7th century, that means there was something there in the mid 7th century that was called a book that seemed to be pulling things in from other areas. But let me just, before we get into that part, do you see that this also supports what we've been finding out with carbon dating, the carbon dating dates for the Birmingham folios? Remember the Birmingham folios that became very popular in 2015? And the Birmingham folios in 2015, when they were discovered, were really only referring to two pieces of paper that had 33 verses on them. And those 33 verses, they say, were dated from 568 to 645. 568, 645, Muhammad was born 570, dies in 632. It covers his whole life. They were saying this is the earliest Quran. What they didn't realize is when you look at those 33 verses, they have nothing to do with Muhammad. They have nothing to do with Islam. They have nothing to do at all with what happened after Muhammad died, or what after 632. It all predates Islam. In fact, take a look at the subjects of those 33 verses. They have to do with the seven sleepers of Ephesus. That's from 500 AD. It also has to do with James the Lesser. That's from 145 AD. It also has to do with the story of Moses. That's from the 15th century BC. These all predate Islam. They all predate the 7th century. And what's interesting is they would have been in existence at the time Umar was living. Could this be part of that material that Umar is bringing together? Now, your friend LaFontaine, just explain to me real quickly, what is his thesis about the Furqan? Or the Furqan is another name for the Quran, which became later the Quran. What was his thesis about?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say something just to maybe as a balance against what Leo has said. It's not necessarily correct that there was a book in the early 7th century. It was probably still just a loose collection of notes. And one of the clues towards that is the fact that there's an awful lot of repetition of certain points, which isn't consistent with a unified book being put together by these three individuals. But the basic thesis is that we have a head preacher and apprentice preachers, as it were, and their mission is basically to propagate their sect, their Judeo-Christian sect. They are following many of the Jewish precepts. They believe that Jesus is just an ordinary human being. He's not God. He's just a servant of Allah. And they have a mission, which is to go out and preach their version of the Bible, their understanding of the Bible, and assisting them with that is a lectionary, which was to be used in their liturgical gatherings. So their times of prayer, worship. And a lectionary, for those who are not aware, is a collection of different Bible readings. And so the idea was that they were going to translate it into Arabic so as to encourage the Arabs to join their sect. So this was parallel to the military campaign that was going on at the same time. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, what was going on. And so what you've seen in the Quran is people like Umar giving advice to apprentice preachers in terms of what to say, what stories to add in. So if you think about all of those Syriac stories that you mentioned, these are basically like the salt and pepper to spice up their homilies, their preaching. They're not really directly related to the Bible. They're just there to make their sermons a little bit more relevant to the Arabs and make it more interesting. And they have obviously a different understanding of the Bible passages to, let's say, the rabbinical Jews, who are referred to as the kuffar, the coverers, because from their perspective, the rabbinical Jews are covering up the real message with all their Talmud and all the Mishnahs and so on. They believe that they're the ones that are getting back to the original meaning, and that's what they're all about. And so that's, a large part of what you find in the Quran. It's like a preacher's manual. It was only meant to be from one preacher to another preacher. Here's what to say, and so on. That's the main thesis, as I understand it.
Is actually supporting what other scholars have done before him. This man here, Luxembourg, says much the same thing. He wrote this in around 2000, and this edition is 2007, and it's known as the Syro-Aramaic reading of the Quran, where he looks and I did a video on it. It's up online. You can see it, where he suggests that much of the material in the Quran today has been borrowed from the Syro-Aramaic Christian writings. That were lifted out, but when they lifted it out, they brought the mystery with them. They didn't understand in putting it into Arabic, and that's why you have so much confusion in the Quran today, why about 20% of the Quran is just misunderstood. He said it's not misunderstood if you go back to the Syro-Aramaic. You can see in almost every case, he solves it. The other man who was probably even more striking is this guy here, Gunther Lulling. This book, actually, Gunther Lulling was a friend of mine. We actually went to Germany, got his transcript written in German. We had it translated into English. This is the result of that. It's a real tome where he has gone back to all these Christian hymns, again, in Aramaic, Syro-Aramaic. He went back to all these Christian hymns that were lifted straight out of these Christian hymns from the 5th and 6th century and then put into the Quran, so that so much of the poetry in the Quran come from these Christian hymns. But you don't understand the real poetry in them until you go back to the Syro-Aramaic to see the antecedents to that, much like what Olaf Lafontaine. But that's for another video. That's for another time. We need to go to that. Let's stick with Muhammad this time, because it looks like the Muhammad you're bringing up could have had material like these lectionaries, like these private documents which are passing back and forth, never meant to be public, and yet he's being confronted on the Leo III is confronting him on this. Back to your screens again.
Now, I don't know if I've said this bit already. I may have. So if we compare Leo III with the Alawites Trinity, it's pretty obvious when you compare the two lists that there's a connection between Umar and Muhammad, because the other two, Abu Turab and Ali, correspond, and Salman the Persian and Salman al-Farsi is obviously Salman the Persian as well. So the Alawites seem to suggest that Umar was in fact Muhammad. That is possibly the big secret hidden in the Alawite sect. But it gets better. Leo says Umar was one of those who wrote the book, or at least the material that ended up in the later book presented to the world under Abdul al-Malik and later caliphs. So from the point of view of Umar in the 8th century, he's obviously aware that there is now some form of a collection. Now, it may not have been true in the middle of the 7th century, but at least by the early 8th century, and he's aware that Umar is one of the writers of this book. But what was the book called? So this is significant. First, it was called the QUR'AN, which means your salvation, as Leo alludes to. Okay? So the idea was this book was all about the idea of salvation. It was because it was connected to that preaching that we mentioned earlier on. The preacher's job was to go and bring salvation to people by converting them to their particular sect. And obviously, as you mentioned, this is a Judeo-Christian sect. It is not what we call Islam today. Second, it is then referred to as the Book of Allah in the Caliph protocols written in the 690s. So you can see there's now a progression, new name for it, Book of Allah. But at some point, they must have felt, well, it's not quite the right name for it yet. So they came up with a third name for this collection, and it was called the Quran. Now, what's interesting is that this is a misnomer, as it isn't technically a lectionary. The Aramaic word QUR'AN, a book with biblical readings, is what the Quran is in terms of the meaning of the word Quran. But the Quran itself is not a collection of biblical readings. But what the Quran is doing is talking about another book which has those biblical readings in it and which is translated into Arabic. So that's what's going on. And I believe they called it the Quran because the word itself is found in the text of the book, and that's why they decided to go with the word Quran. But this shows that they didn't understand what they were dealing with. This was the wrong word to call it. So this was, I would suggest, a mistake that they made at that time. They shouldn't have called it the Quran. It's the wrong name for the book. Sorry, I forgot there was that bit there. Okay, so a lot of this material that I've mentioned here comes from Murad. But if we go from there, we got an interesting extra piece from Faye, our good friend Faye, who sent
for everybody to know who is Murad and who is Faye, because not many people know who these people are. These are people on your team, but just introduce them to our current audience.
Yeah, so Murad is a guy from the Middle East. He speaks Arabic, and he is doing a lot of research, as I am, into the origins of Islam. Faye is a woman from the Southern Hemisphere, and she's also done some interesting research in the background, and she has done an interesting study in relation to the night sky in the early 7th century, and she came up with an interesting event that occurred in the year 610, which was that during a crescent moon in the year 610, the planet Mars came out from under it, and this event may have been a trigger point at that time, a significant event that might have led to what happened in 614, the conquest of Jerusalem by a Jewish, Arabic, and Persian group. But that was a little bit of research that she did. But this is from her. She says, I was just reading an online post explaining the meanings of Furqana and Farouk. The word source is F or Q,
Baraka,
which in Assyrian means to save, salvation, or savior. So when Umar conquered Jerusalem, he was labeled as the Farouk, the savior, by the then Christians who were persecuted by the Romans. Now, what's interesting, whenever you ask a Muslim, what does Farouk mean? They always hide this part of the meaning. I don't know why, but we can probably guess. But if you ask them, they will always say, no, no, Farouk means, it means someone who judges right from wrong. I hear this all the time. But the actual primary meaning is to do with salvation. That's what it means. So it's interesting that they've been scripted to avoid making reference to this primary meaning of the word Farouk. And we'll see why in a moment. So when we look at this, your famous statement, the book and the man, the book and the man.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the book is the QUR'AN, which means salvation. The man is Umar, and his epithet is Al-Faruq, the savior. So you can see how those two are linked. And then another epithet, another title, as we saw earlier, is Ibn al-Khattab, the son of the book, the son of the writing. So even from within the Islamic tradition, they are revealing everything that Leo has just said, which is that Umar is one of the people behind this book.
Yeah.
He is the guy that has been writing some of these passages that became what we call today the Quran. So this is hugely significant.
This is
great. Want
great.
to jump in on that?
This is fascinating because you're not only looking at the antecedents for the man Muhammad, as we've been trying to find him in the 7th century. It looks like Umar is that man. He fits every category. He's in the right place, way up north. He's in Jerusalem. He comes with a sword. He takes on the description as the Christ who is yet to come. He refers to himself as having the keys of paradise, all these other things that we see who this Umar is. But he also is the one who is responsible for these lectionaries, these bringing together these private discussions with he and another, which could also be the antecedent to the Quran, the book and the man, the book and the man, the book and the man. You're right, that is my signature piece, but what you're doing is you're finding antecedents to both the book and the man in one fell swoop. And here we're doing everything from the 7th century. We're looking at the 8th century for Leo III to refer back to the 7th century, but he's referring to very real people who lived in the 7th century and a very real piece of literature. Not a book yet. We don't know it as a book yet. It then became the Quran. Even the word qara'a, to recite, it looks like that also comes from the same source. Great stuff. I love this. This is exciting.
Okay, but let's see who is the real savior. Is it Muhammad or Jesus? Umar was assassinated, according to different reports. He lived by the sword and he died by the sword. According to one report, he was stabbed, I think it was 6 times, apparently, and he died 3 days later of his wounds. Jesus was crucified, but he rose again 3 days later. What a contrast between the two. I would suggest Jesus is the real savior, and Umar couldn't save anyone, including himself.
Yeah.
So that's...
the wrong man at the wrong place, doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. We've got the right man at the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. Go ahead. Terrific. Now, this is the good, beautiful thing. Have you noticed what you have done is what I've asked you to do? Thanks so much, Mel. You've gone back to the 7th century. You're willing to say that what you said earlier about Ilyas ibn Qabisa may have been wrong. We can thank people like Joe and others who have tried to say, wait a minute, be careful. There's someone that fits the bill much better. And it's not Ilyas ibn Qabisa. It looks like it's this man, Umar. And this Umar is the right man at the right place. So it makes sense that they're referring to him. So it makes sense that he is in Jerusalem. Muhammad was never in Jerusalem. Umar was in Jerusalem. Muhammad never had a sword that far north or lived just close to Gaza. That's way too far north. We're talking about 1,000 miles too far north. Yet, when you look back and see, if you're going to put and say that this could be the first Muhammad, this could be the 7th century Muhammad, it's fascinating because anybody could be called Muhammad. That is a title, is it not? It is the praised one. If you're somebody in command, if you would see yourself as a prophet, most people who were in the 7th century considered themselves to be prophets. They wanted that mantle to give them more authority. That would be very easy to also use that as an epithet. That was one of his epithets, because the praised one of God would be something you would want to have behind your name, again, to give you credibility. But here, what I find fascinating is you're moving into another area, and that is this guy also had something to do with some writings. Now, these writings are the ones that are appearing now that we're seeing from the 7th century that have been carbon dated to that time. Could that be part of it? Could we be what Olaf is saying? Is there something also from this that the Quran was finally derived. Even the word itself, the qara, which became a succession of words, the Furqan being the first, all the way up to qara, which we now know today in Arabic means the recitation. Well, these lectionaries were recited, were they not? That's what you do with lectionaries. That's the whole purpose of lectionaries. But the lectionaries that they were reciting were actually controlled and recreated by Christians. Fascinating. And the poetry that we see in the Quran today is probably created from that source. This is the stuff we love. And this is why it's important that you're doing what you're doing, Mel, even though you're supposed to be on vacation. God bless you for keeping awake at night and making sure that you run through in your mind, your great mind, all these different areas that keep bringing up little flags here and there. Now, folks, this is a whole new context. This is a whole new theory. This is a whole new, what we're going to call green papers. I've been told, be careful. White papers are what you go out as a proposal once you've come up with your ideas. Green paper is what you do. You put it out there to see what how people react. So we're going to redirect this as a green paper that we want to make into a white paper. This is a green paper, which means, folks, if you see what you like, if you don't see what you don't like, for heaven's sake, say what you want. Put it here at the bottom. Get your comments out there. Let's see what you're saying. Let's start this discussion. Let's keep it going. So what do you think about what Mel's put together? What do you think about his team, Faye and Murad and Joe, who are coming up with all these different ideas? It's not just one person. It's not just one person here coming up with everything. We're all coming up and we're putting together and making sense of it. You need to make sense of it as well, and especially you Muslims. Do you really feel you have the right man in the right place? The Savior, Farouk, is he Muhammad? Or, as Mel ended his whole talk with, is Jesus really that Savior? Because that is what the Messiah is, the Christ. One who is anointed to what? Anointed to save. And that's why we would like to introduce Jesus as the one, the real one, who you need to come back to. But fortunately, we know we have the right man in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time, all from the first century, from documents that we have back there. We're asking the same thing of you Muslims, to do what we've already done with Jesus. Now you must do with Muhammad. Mel, this has been great. Thanks a lot. God bless you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.